Next, we're going to look at language development in the school years. Here's these key terms, so we're kind of moving into chapter 6 here. So we talk so much about language in early childhood and about how the language you learned in early childhood is extremely important for your success throughout your school years and beyond. So you might say, well, what is there left to learn if we kind of learn everything we need to know? Well, think about things like this. School-age children typically speak in sentences. They use complex sentences. They're able to talk about their past, the present, and the future. They have large and varied vocabulary. So how did they get there? If we didn't explicitly teach those things, and sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, how did they go from those things we look for in their early language development to now? And what are they acquiring as we are teaching? That's what we're going to kind of look at when we talk about language development in the school age years, because it's definitely still developing. In the school years, they're expected to understand and somewhat study language. They're expected to apply their skills to both reading and writing. They're expected to be successful in classroom discussions. They're expected to be successful in their unstructured social time. So thinking about that in terms of pragmatic language, they're supposed to pretty much have down. And their vocabulary becomes, again, more complex and specialized. And that's what kind of keeps them on course with their peers. So what about that kiddo that comes in with minimal language skills to begin with? One thing I want to point out is right around 3rd grade, 4th grade, kids really are going to switch from learning to read, from reading to learn. That's what we talk about. And so they need those literacy skills quick, because all of a sudden, the older they get, they're expected to just learn from reading, kind of like you are from this course. You come to lecture, but I also expect you to just gather information through reading your chapters that you're assigned. There's kind of a similar occurrence with language. For a little bit, you are learning language, and then all of a sudden, you need to use language to continue to learn. And so if you don't have that foundation, it's hard for you to make that switch, because you don't even have the language you need to continue learning, to use it to your advantage and continue learning. Structural elements, this is a quick glance, mostly just again a visual to help you see what's happening. I'm not going to quiz you on all these terms, but when we look at morphology, you can see there's a couple there. A couple things that'll change. Syntax is a huge area of growth. So grammar is a huge area of growth and development. Semantics, that's our vocabulary again. A huge growth is seen there developmentally. And pragmatics, they'll continue to grow, should continue to grow in those social skills and social language areas. And we're going to look at some of these things a little closer, but you can still see there's plenty to learn and to use. In semantics, specifically looking at vocabulary, there's something called expository discourse. So the use of language to convey information. An example of this is when a high school student has to explain the steps to a chemistry experiment. They're using language to tell you something, to convey something, to convey their understanding of something. It's what I'm doing to you right now. I'm using language to try and teach you something. If you have a hard time even understanding language, you're going to have a hard time using your language to reflect back your knowledge. So we do this a lot. That's a common practice, because when you retrieve things, that helps you solidify it. So even just like your first book report or your first class presentation, you have to use expository discourse. You have to use the words you know to explain what you're learning. And so think about how if your language were delayed at all, that would be really, really hard to do as you got older. And kids really start doing this as early as kindergarten and 1st grade. You do little presentations in front of your class, or even just show and tell. You're telling them about what you brought from home. And then another big area I wanted to talk about was figurative or non-literal language. Um, and things like metaphors, idioms, jokes, irony, or sarcasm. This comes along with age. Frankly, I'm already pretty sarcastic with my kids because I tend to be sarcastic and joking all the time. But that's actually very hard. That's a very higher level language function is humor and non-literal language, not, saying something that means something else. When you say it's raining cats and dogs, some kids, I'm thinking of children with autism specifically that usually have a very hard time with figurative language, are thinking, are you kidding me? Dogs and cats are falling from the sky, and that's not what you mean, but they don't. This is something that develops and is incredibly important for their success academically and just socially as they move forward. So those questions, how do they use it expressively versus receptively versus socially? Expressively, they're going to use it in their speaking and their writing. Receptively, it's going to either help or hinder their ability to understand what they're hearing or what they're reading. And socially, it's huge. They're either going to have a hard time understanding the joke. And so let's just say one time they really like this kid, and this kid is really reinforced when kids laugh at his jokes. Well, if you're the kid that doesn't laugh at the joke, he's probably not going to come tell you the joke next time. And so quickly you become unpopular, and it all stems from you not understanding the joke in the first place, and you don't know you should laugh because that's what makes a friend want to talk to you. Or they can actually very much so accidentally offend people when they take things literally because they don't understand all these patterns and all these instances of non-literal language that are all around them. So it has a huge effect on kids. And you see this developing very much in the school years. If we were together, I was going to have you make a list of some common slang terms that you might be hearing these days. It makes me sound so old. Plus, if you guys taught me some, I would increase my street cred, which would be, I said, a hashtag double bonus. But, I think about even the generational gap between my parents and I. And sometimes when I say things that are total slang, and they're like, what are you talking about? And I just have to say, oh, this means this now. And there's always going to be that. There's always going to be that generational gap. But, we're all pretty forgiving of that. Or you just roll your eyes and say, oh, Mom, you're so old. But imagine if that was all the time, every day, and everything you read, and every conversation with a friend, and every TV show you watched. It was just all around you, and you were constantly thinking, I do not know what that means. Or you were taking it literally, which would just compound the confusion. So it's really important. And unfortunately, what happens to the students who do not understand these meanings, they're usually ostracized. And that's really tough because again, we know the importance of pragmatic language, and it's just kind of contributes to that negative cycle I've talked to you about so far. Again, specific to pragmatics, we know there are a lot of skills necessary for successful conversation, like we were just talking about the use of non-literal language. But they're going to start needing to be able to use narratives, which includes the skills of staying on a topic, making relevant comments, shifting between topics, having an organized layout. It's just really common that we communicate with stories. I mean, just a minute ago, I was telling you about Uncle Rob in the elevator with those two gentlemen, and how eye-opening it is that, 2021, people still don't understand the importance of reading to their children. And so not only are we expected to use stories, but we're expected to gather understanding. I use that story to reiterate the fact of we got to be proactive in helping not only our own children, but the kids we're going to serve and the families we're going to serve understand that key principle. And so I use that story to share that meaning. I didn't just repeat over and over, read to your kids. I tried to give you a story as to, the relevance of reading to your kids. So there's so much expected that we not only use them, but we understand them and we gather meaning from them. And so if you're in a classroom where you're supposed to be gathering something from a story and you don't, how does that impact you academically? A great deal, because there's a lot of ways that we learn through stories in school. Then just a simple indirect request, and we kind of reviewed this before, but if a teacher is saying, it's getting loud in here, and your kid just continues to talk loud because they didn't hear the teacher say be quiet, versus maybe a neurotypical person would be like, oh, that's their passive way of telling me I better be quiet. Or if a teacher says, you can go back to class now. I have another story for you. When I was working in the schools, I had a student, he was in 3rd grade, and he was on the autism spectrum, and he was extremely literal, and I knew this about him. I'd worked with him for a couple of years. But, as I did with most kids when they were leaving therapy, I would say, okay, you can go back to class now. So this was not the first day of school, mind you. This was somewhere in the middle of the semester. And so I had sent those kids back and checked my schedule and, was going to get the next group of kiddos. And I looked down the hall and this child is just standing in front of his classroom door, like almost touching his nose to the door. That's shut. He's just standing there. So I watch him for a minute. And finally I approach him and I said, hey, bud, why didn't you go back to class? And he said, well, you told me to go back to class, but you didn't tell me to open the door and go inside. And so just because in this occasion the teacher had the door shut for whatever reason, he didn't know he could go in because for whatever reason, he just took it very literal. Like, I technically did go back to class. I didn't just go inside. So again, think about kids that this would affect even just with their teachers, because maybe the teacher thinks they're being stubborn when really they just don't have the pragmatic skills to understand all these things that we're just supposed to pick up from context, or all these things we just kind of know that maybe some kids don't. Next, we're going to go over meta-linguistic activity. And this just means when you're in school, you have to start thinking about language. It's not just something you do, you have to think about. And that's kind of hard. So you have to think about grammar rules, and you have to think about phonemic awareness. If they have a hard time separating sounds within their words, they're most likely going to have difficulty making associations between sounds and their letters. And that can lead to poor word recognition, and eventually that can lead to poor comprehension. So that's an example of thinking about language, having that example I was giving you earlier where you have cat and we say, take away the k, what's left, and they have to hold that word in their memory and kind of separate the sounds and think about the language and give you an answer. But this research in 1991 was just showing one example. If they can't do that, if they can't think about how to separate their words, they tend to have a hard time connecting letters to sounds, which leads to poor word recognition and poor comprehension. It's all connected.